All right, so this video is all about Scraper. Essentially how you take your game list to go from looking like this, which is just a simple set of text for each game, to something more like this, which has box art, video playing, description, text, etc. And the settings are all pretty simple to do. Essentially, you're going to open up the main menu, and then you'll see an option here at the top called Scraper. Open that. And I'm going to go through each one of these settings in depth, and then I'll have sections of this video where I go into other specific use cases as well. But for now, we'll just get things set up out of the box. So the first option here is Scrape From, and Scrape From has two options today, Screen Scraper and the Games DB. Recommendation to start with is to try Screen Scraper first. It has the most robust metadata today, and usually you'll find the game you're looking for through that, along with its videos things as well. And I typically will use the Games DB as more of a fallback. Let's say Screen Scraper doesn't have a particular game. Trying Games DB may help you find it. The next setting here is called Scrape These Games. And this is important when you are both starting out with a fresh library as well as updating an existing one. And I'll talk through these settings more in depth later in the video, but as a high level right now, all games basically means scrape every game for the systems that I've selected. Another really important setting here is no metadata, which essentially says only scrape games for the systems I've selected that don't have metadata. And that includes descriptions, titles, things like that. And then no game image and no video kind of act in a similar way. So keep that in mind. I'll hold that and talk back to that in a second section of the video later on. All right, Scrape These Systems. Now, Scrape These Systems allows you to select the specific systems you care about scraping when you start a scrape action. In this case, I'm only going to scrape PC Engine, so I have that selected. But let's say you were standing up a new library from scratch and you had like a small number of games. You could reasonably go here and click Select All and select every system and start that way. However, I would only recommend doing this if your library is small. If you're trying to scrape a library of 5,000, maybe even more games, this is going to take a long time to do. From my experience, on average, a scrape takes between 5 to 10 seconds per game. So take the number of games you're trying to scrape and math it out from there. You could kind of see how long it might take. My recommendation, do system by system. It's usually pretty more straightforward and easy to do. So in this case, I've only selected one system, which is PC Engine. The next setting here is very important, especially if you selected Screen Scraper up there. Go to screenscraper.fr and sign up for an account. And accounts there are free, and basically that gives you access to scrape from them with much more ease of use. You could also sign up for a paid account there, but I won't get into that because I don't know the details. But essentially sign up for a Screen Scraper account, then take your username and password and enter it here under account settings. And then content settings is super important too. This basically allows you to select exactly what metadata and media you want to download from Scraper when you're doing that action. In this case, I want game names, ratings, other metadata. Those basically refer to the name of the game, the rating of the game, and other metadata, things like the developer, the description, things like that. I also care about videos, so I'm downloading those. I care about screenshots, title screens, box covers, back covers, marquees. I usually turn off 3D boxes. Again, this will depend on your preference. And then physical media I like to download, but keep in mind, physical media is pretty limited in scope right now on Screen Scraper. And then I'm leaving game manuals off because I want to show you later how to scrape for a specific type of media that you haven't downloaded yet without rescraping everything. So I'm going to keep that off for now, and we'll come back to that later. But again, high level here, essentially this allows you to select exactly what metadata you care about. And then when you start scraping things, it'll basically download this metadata. Let's go back. The next setting here is Miximage settings. And Miximages essentially look like this. Let me actually go into the media viewer. And you could see here, this is a mix image. And these are generated by ESDE once you're downloading metadata. And that mix image settings menu allows you to customize how these are generated. I'll probably do a second section on this as well, or a dedicated section on this, because it's a little bit more involved. But by default, if you change nothing, this is what it would look like. So if you're downloading marquees, box art, physical media, and screenshots, it'll use those files to generate this image automatically for you. It's pretty sweet. All right, let's go back to PC Engine, Scraper. And I'll just open Miximage settings quickly just to show you. Basically, there's a ton of options here for you to tweak things. Again, I'll do a dedicated section on that later. And then the last option here is Other Settings. Other Settings is important because it helps you specifically define things like your region preference. So in this case, because I'm in the US, I'm typically used to the box art and things that were released in the US as well. So I set my default region as USA. And you can change that to Europe, Japan, or World. And essentially what that does is it says try to scrape for box art or media that matches that region first. And if not, if nothing is found for that, then fall back to the default region of the game at that point. Another important setting to call out here is interactive mode. Typically, I'll leave that off, especially if I'm scraping a large library. With it on, what it does is if it finds an error trying to scrape a given game, it'll give you a prompt to figure it out. So what you could do is turn that on and then also set auto accept single game matches. And that will essentially function like for all games that it can find a match to, no problem, it'll just scrape them. And only for games where it can't, it'll prompt you. But for larger libraries, I think it's pretty safe to have this turned off. And then what basically will happen, if it doesn't find a match for your game, it'll just skip it. And then you could go back to it later and scrape it manually one-off, which I'll also show you how to do later in this video. And then all these other settings here are documented very well in the user guide, which I'll link in the description below. Essentially read through that. If you have any questions on that, just ask us on Discord. All right. So what I'm going to do now is actually do this in real time. I have all games set to be scraped for PC Engine specifically from Screen Scraper. And my content settings are going to download names, ratings, metadata videos, screenshots, titles, box covers, and physical media. So now if I actually go to Scraper and then start at the bottom here, we're going to do this in real time together. All right, so let that run. And you can see basically it's going to take about 5 to 10 seconds per game. And this will also vary depending on Screen Scraper's bandwidth at the time. So keep that in mind as another proxy. This is why I recommend doing system at a time, because if you're doing like a large amount of games, this could take a pretty long time to do. All right, so that was real time and basically has scraped all 5 of those games. In a moment, it should be done. There we go. Perfect. All right. Now, if I go back into that system here, you could see now we have Miximages, descriptions, metadata, titles. And if I go into Media Viewer, you could see the video playing, the box art, the back box art, the title screen, screenshot, the mix image. And remember, I didn't scrape manuals yet, but I'll show you how to do that later in the video. All right, so that's basically the default out of the box. Next, I'm going to talk through basically the different options for scrape disk games and show you how that works and how you could use that effectively if you basically are updating your library. All right. All right, so let's talk about the scrape these games menu item here, and what it does. Now, this is super useful if you're, let's say, updating a given system. So let's say you had 10 games and you scraped them and then you added another 5. This allows you to scrape those new 5 games without re-scraping the other 10 you've already done. So I'm going to show you how that works in real time here on the device. And I'm also going to show you something else as part of this. So I have these 5 games scraped, right? So what I'm going to do is actually delete some of this metadata so I could demonstrate the other piece. But in doing so, I'll show you something also pretty cool. So if I go to edit this game's metadata and go down to clear, this is an option that you do directly in ESDE to delete metadata for a given game. So if I press clear here, you'll see this deletes any media files and the game list XML entry for this game, which means it's metadata. And the game itself will remain on your device. So this is a simple way to like clear scraped data for a game while keeping the game on your device itself. So if I do that, you'll see Die Hard's still there, and all of the metadata is gone. I'm also going to do it for Batman, so we have 2 games that we could test this with. All right, so now that I have those 2 games without metadata and these 3 games here with, there's a few options. One obvious option is to scrape individually, which you could do if you're adding 1 game at a time. Basically, to do that, you're going to press select, go to edit this game's metadata, and you'll see at the bottom here an option for scrape. Clicking that option will use all of the settings you have in scraper menu to scrape that single game. So that's one way to scrape a single entry. But in this case, I have 2 games without metadata. And there's a faster way to do that versus going into each individual one. So you're going to press start, go into scraper, and this is where scrape these games comes into play. So by default, scrape these games is set to all. And if I had started a scrape right now, it would rescrape every game in the system for PC Engine, which I don't want to do. So what I can do instead is go in here, and in this case, because I know Batman and Die Hard don't have any metadata, I'm going to set it to no metadata. And now, screen scraper, no metadata, PC Engine. If I start the scrape action, you should see it only show 2 games. See? Game 1 of 2. Batman first. And then when Batman's done, it should scrape Die Hard, which it's doing now. And then when that's done, I'll basically have those 2 games scraped. And I would not basically have everything kind of set up the way I want. So that's a simple way to start adding new games to a library. When you're doing scraping, you don't need to scrape the entire list again. You could set this to only scrape games without metadata, or scrape games without an image, or scrape games without video. So this is a super useful way to basically update your library over time and not have to rescrape everything over and over again. All right, so remember at the beginning of the video, I didn't scrape manuals. So now I might be asking, I want to scrape manuals now for my games. I want to view those, but I don't want to scrape everything else again for those games. So this is another method. So we're going to change this here, scrape these games. We're going to change that back to all. But we're also going to go into content settings here and turn all of these off, except for game manuals, which will turn on. So this is a method for basically augmenting your existing downloaded metadata with new metadata you download previously. So in this case, I'm only downloading game manuals for all games in PC Engine. If I press start here, it's basically going to show 1 of 5. But all this is doing behind the scenes is just downloading the PDF for the manual. Everything else that I already have on my device, it's not re-downloading again. So give this a second. And you can see it goes a little bit faster than before. But when this is done, I'll basically have PDF files for manuals for these games as well. So if I go into, let's say, Koryun, which I know has PDF, you can see now I have a PDF manual. So yeah, that's a quick way to basically augment existing metadata. So you can hopefully starting to see how all these settings kind of interact with each other. Scrape these games is useful if you're, say, adding a new set of games and you want to only localize your scrape to those new games. And content settings is useful if you want to add additional downloaded metadata that you didn't previously download before. And you could use those in kind of interesting combinations with each other. So if that makes sense, rock and roll. All right, let's talk about Miximages. So again, Miximage at the end of the day is this file here. Now this is generated when you are scraping your other media from Screen Scraper or GamesDB. And essentially it's a collage of media that you scraped. So in this case, the collage includes the box art, physical media, a screenshot, and the marquee. And I'm going to show you basically how to set the settings for this in this menu here. So open up Scraper and then Miximage settings. Miximage resolution essentially defines the size that the Miximage will be generated at. I typically would leave this at 1280 by 960. You have some other options here. The options here generally will translate into file size. So I find a good middle ground is 1280 by 960. Horizontal screenshot and vertical screenshot fit basically define how screenshots should be generated in the mix image. Again, if you look at the mix image here, you could see the screenshot is contained basically in a 4:3 aspect ratio space. So you could imagine if you're scraping, let's say, a vertical shooter game or a 16:9 aspect ratio game, those settings refer to how the screenshots of those games will be fit within this 4:3 space. So if I go here, scraper, mix image, crop basically means crop it to fit within the 4:3 space. Contain means keep its original aspect ratio and fit it within that 4:3 space. And stretch means basically fill the space completely, forget aspect ratio altogether. My preference is typically crop. Contain is pretty good as well, but crop is what I recommend. Now, those settings basically have another corresponding setting here called blank areas fill color. And if I had set, let's say, horizontal fit to be contain, then this setting here for fill color would define what color is used to fill the blank space. So in this case, it's black, but you could also set it to be frame, which will choose the frame color of the mix image instead. Other settings that are important, box size and physical media size. These basically set the size at which to include those images in the picture. And you could tweak this and try to find one that works for you. I typically think medium and large are pretty good. And this setting is super important. If you have this turned off, then when you're scraping images, then you won't generate mix images. So if you care about mix images, keep that on. If you don't care about mix images, turn that off. All right, let's see. Let's go to, all right, these are also important. So include marquee and include box image. If you have these turned off, then basically it won't include those images in the generated mix image at the end of the day. So you could play with that, see what you like, but I think the defaults are pretty good. And then use cover image if 3D box is missing. If you remember earlier in the video, I didn't scrape 3D boxes. So I usually have that turned on so that it includes the 2D box image instead. And then of course, include physical media image is similar to include box or marquee. This basically allows you to tweak what images you want to have in your generated mix. And the last setting is super cool. So if you, for example, had turned off the generation of mix images altogether, or you had changed some of these settings and wanted to see what they look like, this option allows you to generate new mix images without scraping again. So if I go to offline generator, and if I were to press start here, it would basically start the generation of mix images for the system I have selected, which in this case was PC Engine, and do it offline without hitting screen scraper at all. So this is a super easy way to, one second, let's get back out of here. A super easy way to like tweak settings here. Let's say I didn't want to have marquees and I wanted to see what that looked like. I could turn that off, go to offline generator and press start, and it would generate new mix images without ever touching screen scraper or GamesDB. So yeah, most of the stuff that you need here is self-contained, which is pretty nice. And mix images are super neat. They look great at the end of the day and just really add a nice little bit of flair to the system overall. Rock and roll. The next I want to show you where this is actually stored. And this will depend on your device. So in this case, because we're using Android, it's going to be stored in your ESD folder there. But if you're doing this on PC, you look in your ESD folder there as well. So let's open up my file browser here. In this case, I'm in internal memory, ESDE, which is where I have my ESD folder on this device. And you'll see a folder here called downloaded media. So downloaded media is where it's going to store all the images, videos, box art that it downloads for a particular system. So if we go into PC Engine, which we just scraped, you could see it has a folder for each media type. If I open up covers, for example, you'll see all the box covers that it's downloaded. And if I go to marquees, you could see all the marquee logos that it's downloaded, etc. So that's a really quick way to see where all of your media is. If you wanted to back it up, sync it to another computer. One benefit of using ESD in multiple places is this structure for downloaded media is consistent across device. So you can reasonably mirror this across your devices and have the same metadata available on all systems, We'll probably do a separate video about that later on, but for now, just keep that in mind. The other folder that's important here is called game list. And game list is where you store the actual metadata for the game. So in this case, PC Engine, there's a game list.xml file in PC Engine. If I were to open up this file, it's going to list the titles of every game, the description of every game. Essentially, all the metadata I downloaded will be in here. So the two folders really to keep in mind: game lists, metadata, and downloaded media, images, videos, PDFs, etc. All right.